Good morning to you. Well, he'd said famously he'd rather be dead in a ditch. But last night, Boris Johnson did send the letter asking for another delay in Brexit. He was clearly cross, he didn't sign it, and he sent another 2 letters as well, explaining he didn't really mean it. But now it's over to the EU to decide who matters most, Britain's Prime Minister or Britain's Parliament. This morning I'm joined by 3 people central to what happens next. By the Foreign Secretary and Boris Johnson's Brexiteer deputy, Dominic Raab. Does he agree with the Prime Minister that extension means extinction for the Tories? By Sir Oliver Letwin, the man who ruined Boris Johnson's day yesterday and is ferociously attacked in this morning's papers, how is he going to behave when the deal comes back next week? And by the shadow Brexit Secretary, Labour's Sir Keir Starmer, chief architect of its anti-Johnson strategy. Does he have more surprises waiting for us in the week ahead? Reviewing the papers, some of them very, very angry this morning, Helen Lewis from The Atlantic, The Telegraph's Brexit sage, Peter Foster, and the Daily Mail's Sarah Vine. But first, the news with Chris Mason.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. Boris Johnson has responded to his Brexit setback by sending a letter to the EU asking for an extension to the UK's withdrawal date, but he's refused to sign it. He's also sent a second letter warning against further delay. The Prime Minister was legally obliged to ask for the extension after MPs voted to withhold approval of his Brexit deal. The European Council President, Donald Tusk, says he will consult other EU leaders about how to respond. MPs on both sides of the Brexit debate were heckled by demonstrators as they left the Houses of Parliament yesterday. Cabinet Ministers Andrea Leadsom and Jacob Rees-Mogg were both given a police escort. The Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott was filmed being jeered by demonstrators. Later, the Shadow Women and Equalities Minister Dawn Butler said she had felt intimidated. Thousands of people in Hong Kong are defying a police ban to take part in an illegal march. Police declared the planned march illegal on Friday, citing concerns over public safety. Hong Kong's anti-government protest leaders have urged a big turnout despite the risk of arrest. The number of profit warnings given by UK companies has reached its highest level since the financial crisis. 235 warnings were issued in the 9 months to September, many by retailers as the high street continues to struggle. And in a quarter of cases, firms blamed Brexit, especially in areas that are exposed to consumer spending. And the longest non-stop commercial passenger flight has landed in Sydney. The Qantas plane took off from New York and was in the air for 19 hours and 16 minutes. The airline is researching the impact of long flights on passengers and crew. It's considering whether to begin regular non-stop flights between the cities. That's all from me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks, Chris. The great Chris Mason. And so to the front pages. As I said, they can be quite angry. Here's the Mail on Sunday. Today, Britain could have begun to heal after the end of our Brexit purgatory. That was really the sense of Boris Johnson's speech. Instead, posturing MPs subjected us to yet more agonising delay. House of Fools. And photographs there of Jeremy Corbyn, Oliver Letwin, John Bercow and Philip Hammond. The Observer, much calmer, of course. There's the big People's Vote march yesterday. 1 million people, they claim, in central London. The whole of central London full of those demonstrators. But they've also gone with the story you heard on the news. Johnson faces fresh court action, it says, after rejecting delay to Brexit. That's not quite true. He has sent the letter, and it's still unclear whether he has fulfilled the full spirit of the legislation. Humiliated, says the Sunday Mirror. The Sunday Telegraph. Johnson refuses to sign the Brexit delay letter, and they've got their commentator Juliet Samuel on the front page there saying the public will not stand by meekly as MPs continue to block Brexit. It doesn't say exactly what the public are supposed to do instead. And then finally there's the Sunday Times. Boris fights the Brexit wreckers with 3 defiant letters to the EU. Ignore Parliament. I'm not asking for a delay, says the Prime Minister. And their youth training scheme has brought in a new correspondent on the front page. That's John Sargent as their parliamentary correspondent, writing there about how his first first time in the House of Commons press lobby, he was looking down on Winston Churchill. Much to talk about there. Harry and Meghan story, we'll talk about that as well. But let's start, shall we, with the big news overnight, Peter. 3 letters to the EU. So they must be slightly confused. They've got an instruction from the Prime Minister and they've got an instruction from the British Parliament, and they're completely different. What do they do?
Well, not that confused. 3 defiant letters, so Downing Street gets its front page headlines. The truth is, 3 lines of response from Donald Tusk. We got the request, legally, properly constituted, and we will look at it. And that's always been the EU's position. You might not know it from reading these newspapers and lots of things saying Downing Street saying, oh, Macron, Merkel might not give us a deal, watch out. You know, they will give us an extension. Both sides are committed to this deal. The question is how long the extension would be and whether it's necessary. The EU will wait and watch. If there is a meaningful vote or the withdrawal agreement goes over the line and they only need a very short extension to complete the paperwork, as it were, that's what they'll do. If it all goes to pieces this week, and you need a longer extension, I think that's what they'll do too. Angela Merkel, very clear in the European Council in private, there would need to be extensions. And Macron complaining, but also agreeing at bottom line, they would do the extension.
So this means, Sarah Vine, that actually Boris Johnson has some space next week, and he may even have the numbers to get meaningful vote 5, I think it is now, and the legislation through, or the first bit of the legislation through the House of Commons next week.
I think the feeling is there are the will and the numbers are there. It's just obviously there will just be the sort of various obstacles along the way. I mean, Letwin, we don't know what he's going to do next week.
We'll find out
We'll
shortly.
find out, hopefully. But, I think these are all... I think there's a degree of sort of acceptance in the number 10 camp that this is now a process that has to play itself out, and they are just going to stick to their guns, which is what Boris has done. And actually, part of the reason why he's getting somewhere now is that he's just had, he's not deviated. And it's very difficult when you've got all of this noise and all of this sort of shouting and screaming and people jumping up and down to stay focused. But that's what they're trying to do.
And staying focused is not something the news cycle makes very easy. No. For years, not for weeks and months, we've been saying, Boris Johnson, is he going to send the letter? Is he going to send the letter? It would be humiliating if he sends the letter. He can't send the letter. What's he going to do? He sends the letter, and then we all just breathe and move straight on again. He may have been defeated in a really difficult battle yesterday, Helen Lewis, but he may be winning the war.
There is a problem with this number 10, which is that they only seem to have one mode, which is kind of maximum aggression, even when their own actions don't bear that out, even when it's actually slightly counterproductive for what they're going to do. So exactly as Peter said, we had all this 2 weeks of saying we're never going to send this letter. I'd rather die in a ditch than send such a letter. And guess what? He sends the letter. And actually there has been a great deal of pragmatism in coming to concessions. But I think when we talk about how tight this deal is, we really need to do the thing of saying, well, will it pass? But OK, well, should it pass? This is a very different deal to Theresa May's deal. It puts a thick regulatory and customs border down the Irish Sea. And also the destination of travel about what kind of economy, what kind of country we want to be at the end is different from Theresa May. Theresa May wanted to keep us as close as possible to Europe within her red lines of leaving the single market and customs union. This is much different. I think the phrase you once used was Buccaneers Brexit, right? This is about unleashing global Britain on the world to make trade deals with the US.
I mean, the irony of all the sort of Remainer blocking of the deals is that they've actually ended up, if this deal goes through, we've actually ended up with a much more Brexity deal than we would have had if they had gone with the Theresa May deal. Exactly. So there's a sort of slight irony there, I think.
Let's turn, Peter, to the aggression in the paper. Oliver twits, says the Sun. There's been a lot of hostility to those MPs.
Yeah, I mean, and I think people who don't understand the process, I can share their frustration. Let's just get it done. I think the question is, what are we getting done? And already in the Commons yesterday, you could see the next battle, which is this. As Helen says, this deal opens the way to a very hard Brexit, and it's the shape of that Brexit. How hard is it going to be? How, let alone the Irish Sea, how thick is the border going to be, Dover-Calais? What's the cost of that going to be if we want to repatriate the trade competence to do these mythical free trade deals around the world? And I think that trade-off is going to become, that is the battle of the next phase of this if we get to it.
I mean, I think what I would say in defence of Oliver is that he's a very honourable man. He's not the same as someone like Bercow, who's just sort of not honourable in any way. And I think one can agree or not agree with what he's doing, but I think
he's had an awful lot of ordure tipped over his head this morning by the press.
Unfairly, I think. I think he is just doing what he thinks is right.
Helen, let's talk a little bit about the march. They claim 1 million. It was certainly an absolutely huge march. I was right in the middle of it trying to get to the tube station. They closed the tube station. It was a huge, huge march. And I suppose it sends a kind of message to the rest of the world about what some British people think as well. So great success for them, but the whole project for another referendum is in some trouble right at the moment.
It did feel like the twilight of a particular argument. I think if the deal gets passed this week, then the argument changes enormously. But what was really interesting to me, I walked down Whitehall, notepad in hand, and I heard Aisha Hazarika saying as a compare, "Give it up for Dominic Grieve," and the crowd kind of went wild. And I thought, well, look, why did I be in journalism for the last 3 years? I should have pivoted into selling EU berets because there is a thriving trade for that. And this force that wasn't there during the referendum of pro-European, you can say it's an expression of a larger kind of culture war, but there is now this big force in British politics that is grown and is angry and is very motivated, and that will stay with us.
We've spoken a great deal about the anger directed at anti-Brexit MPs, particularly women MPs, online and in person, and all the aggression and the violent threats and so forth. But yesterday, it has to be said, people on the other side of the argument, including your husband, I have to say, got some of the same.
Some flack, and particularly Jacob Rees-Mogg and his 12-year-old son, who I think, probably had... I imagine for the son it must be quite a frightening experience to be surrounded by that sort of... I mean, I know from my... I've got children as well, and occasionally you do get aggression in the street, and it is quite scary for them. I mean, I know that you could argue that he shouldn't really have taken his son to Parliament, but I think he should be able to take his son to Parliament if he really wants to, and it should be OK for him to come out without being shouted at. I mean, I think the thing about politicians is that, no one really feels any sympathy for them, and so to a certain extent you have to suck it up. I mean, this is just what happens if you are in politics in Britain today. The police were amazing. Thank God it's not more violent than that. I think we just have to be,
And almost everybody I talked to had a conspiracy theory of some time. What's really happening behind the scenes is this or that.
What do you mean?
Well, there's a good example of it again in the papers. We're talking about Oliver Letwin, and he's really being controlled by this lawyer David Panic, or he's really being controlled from overseas. All those theories about what the actual motivations are. Whereas it's complicated enough just looking, full frontal at what's going on.
I mean, from my experience of life in politics, there's really never really as much of a conspiracy as you think there is. It's usually just incompetence.
The Panic puppet, the David Panic, the brilliant QC who won If you read the papers, a lot of Number 10 briefings saying, he was Panic's puppet, he was on the phone, Letwin. And then I see David Panic saying, I made no phone call. And it wouldn't have been improper if I had. But it all feeds into this culture war business about the judiciary, everybody under attack, and we all need to be quite careful where this ends up, because the next phase is actually not going to be that much easier than this one.
Well, don't say that, because I think that's the worst thing about this let's get Brexit done, is the idea that actually it ends once we sign off a deal, that's it, rather than instead of going into a standstill transition, if the deal gets signed off, so you won't see that much difference, but with another cliff edge at December 2020, and with, frankly, a political declaration is wide open, and there will be big arguments about what that looks like. The shape of Brexit is still really to play for, even after a deal.
Helen, you were saying, actually, the politics of this is much more significant than people are saying. How important is it that the workers' regulation and the environmental regulations have been moved from the withdrawal agreement, which is legally binding, into the political declaration?
Well, that's exactly what Keir Starmer, the shadow Brexit secretary, was making the point at the dispatch box yesterday, is they've moved from being part of the legally agreed text to a kind of aspiration. And that means that the next set of fights will be really, really bloody. And, Labour has always said, it is, the clue is in the name, that this is the big thing that it cares about not turning us into a deregulated economy where slashing red tape turns out to mean things like cutting maternity leave rights, for example. And that kind of stuff, which is the ERGs, their big hope from Brexit is that we can turn into a different kind of country, is going to be contested.
So I just want to come to the next big issue that we haven't talked about, of course, is Northern Ireland, because it was the DUP votes pivoting that was so important yesterday. And there's a very interesting piece of reporting in The Observer there, a guy who's gone to Lisburn in the heart of unionist Northern Ireland.
And props to The Observer for being the only paper that reported properly from the ground in Northern Ireland. It's a fascinating piece from Rory Carroll, because it both has, in this loyalist stronghold, real fears that actually putting Northern Ireland in a very separate and much more EU-type relationship really is, as it were, lopping off a limb and is going to lead to a united Ireland, which is, of course, loyalists worth fear. But also, as you get through the piece, people are actually more interested in watching the rugby from Japan than get it. And then people saying, look, the order books are looking a bit sketchy. We really need to get this over. And I think this is going to be one of the interesting things. Loyalists now are talking about big demonstrations if this deal goes over, perhaps real trouble in Northern Ireland for the Loyalist community, the hard end of it. And I think that's going to be one of the things to watch, is how actually this deal plays out in Northern Ireland.
And, of course, if the DUP don't flinch, all the assumptions we've been making about saying Boris Johnson may get his bill through, he may well not if the DUP won't move.
Yeah, no, I mean, they do seem to be quite entrenched on this issue. But I think I think all of this is fine. The thing that the general public, there is still, I think, a genuine feel amongst normal people that they just want this thing done and dusted now. They've just had enough.
You know, Tony Blair said we shouldn't let exhaustion and exasperation drive us to something that's the wrong answer.
Well, he's probably right about that, but the fact is that there will come a tipping point where the exhaustion and the exasperation will be worse than anything else we can. I mean, we've just got to keep this, get this resolved.
I think the best analogy for this, though, on Twitter was by Tom Hamilton, who used to work for Labour, said it's a bit like saying, I want to get back to talking about the NHS and schools. It's a bit like saying, I want to get childbirth over and done with so I can get back to getting lots of sleep and reading lots of novels. And, this is really not the end of the Brexit process.
That might be the best analogy of the morning. Thank you all very much indeed for that. And so to the weather. That huge march cramming into central London saw bright sunshine and then sudden, shocking, dousing showers of rain. All across Britain, people will be wondering whether their bonfires are going to be dry enough. Over to the Weather Centre to hear from Thomas Schaffenacker. Thomas.
Thanks, Andrew. Well, the heavens may well open over London again tomorrow. A little unsure about that one, but overall, the weather pattern is calm over the next few days. Certainly, we've got some sunshine in the forecast for you today. A few showers still affecting Scotland and the northeast of England, but on the whole, it's a fine day with just scattered cloud. The temperatures today ranging from around about 14 degrees in the south of the country to a chilly, even as low as 7 degrees on the north coast of Scotland. Now tonight, a lot of dry weather out there, but I mentioned the heavens opening over London, that there is a possibility of a weather front affecting the southeast through the morning and perhaps even until lunchtime. So we might need our brollies in the southeast for a time Monday morning, but the vast majority of the country is looking forward to a fine day on Monday. High pressure is expected to build in off the Atlantic, so that means settled weather. So here's the forecast for Monday morning. See that rain across the southeast, quite possibly East Anglia as well, but the majority of the country are in for a fine start to the week with temperatures averaging around 12 degrees. Andrew, it's over to you.
Thank you so much. Sir Oliver Letwin was warmly greeted by a People's Vote campaigner after his victory over the Prime Minister. Unwisely, perhaps, he grinned broadly, and the picture is used in almost every newspaper as evidence that he's fundamentally hostile to Brexit itself. Is that true? And what are his plans for next week? He joins me right now. Sir Oliver, do you trust the Prime Minister?
I certainly trust that he intends to get this deal, which is the crucial question, and I'm going to support him in doing so by voting for the second reading and right the way through the bill, because I think his deal is a deal that will get us out in an orderly fashion. And I've always believed that that's the one thing that really matters. I said about 18 months in the House of Commons, I vote for any deal. I'll vote for this one.
Why did you skewer him yesterday, then?
Because yesterday wasn't about the deal, despite all the hype. Yesterday was about the question whether the Ben Act will still be effective and whether we'll get an extension if, for any reason, we haven't got the deal completed by the 31st of October. And that, I felt, and have continued to feel, is very important. We need to safeguard the insurance policy that if we don't get this passed by the 31st of October, we don't just crash out of the EU. That was what yesterday was about. Next week is about the deal and the bill. I'll vote for the deal. I'll vote for the bill.
Isn't the truth that you never really thought he was trying for a deal or would get a deal? And if he did, you never really thought he would get through the House of Commons. And when you realised you were wrong about those things, you decided it was time to scupper it.
No, other way round. I thought in August that he wasn't being serious about getting a deal. That was one of the reasons why we put the Ben Act in place. Part of it was just to make sure that if we got to the 31st of October, we hadn't got a deal, we would be safe and not crash out. But part of it was to give him an incentive to get a deal. That, I think, worked. I think he's now got his deal. And now for those of us for whom that was the motivation, we need to back that deal. And as I say, I've been willing to back Theresa May's deal 3 times. I've certainly backed this deal.
You use this word safe, and you're clearly worried about the possibility of coming out without a deal.
Yep.
You don't trust somebody. Is it other Conservatives you don't trust? at the last minute to kind of bring the House down and get us out without a
It's not
deal?
that I don't trust anybody. It's that politicians actually, I know it's very unfashionable, actually do have convictions and beliefs. And when they're faced with particular bits of the bill, there's too high a risk that a narrow majority at second reading, which we'll probably get on Tuesday, I hope, could evaporate as we go through. And I'm very concerned to make sure that if it did evaporate at any stage, despite the fact I shall be voting for it all the way through, then we don't crash out.
So no new traps, no new plans to cause problems for the government next week as far as you're concerned?
No, I'm absolutely behind the government now. As long as they continue with this bill, continue with the deal, I will support it. I will vote for it, as I did for Theresa May 3 times, because I think that's the right thing for this country, to get out in an orderly fashion.
A guarantee there will be no more Oliver Letwin amendments of any kind next week?
There will be no more Oliver Letwin amendments next week because they don't need to be. I'm in support of the bill.
And let me ask you about, as it were, the motivation behind all of this, because you were actually named by Number 10 as somebody they accused of colluding with foreign powers, was the phrase
Yes,
used.
that was the most extraordinary.
Were you colluding with any foreign powers?
No, I haven't colluded with anybody at all. I have colluded with other MPs across party, which I know annoys some people, but I think is a sensible way to do politics. I've colluded with the Lords, because that's another part of our parliament, and I think that's what politicians should do, work together. That's what I call it, rather than colluding.
Specific Lord Panic, David Panic, there's a lot, again, allegations that, if I may put it this way, he was kind of pulling your strings, that he was behind what you were doing yesterday, and he has said himself that he was helping you draft the legislation.
Yes, we've had some of the best lawyers in the land who are in the House of Lords working for us without being paid by anybody, I may say, purely pro bono, and I'm extremely grateful to them. I hope people would agree that it's a good idea that when you're putting forward legislation, it should be proper professional legislation that really first-class lawyers have looked at.
So now you've got your way, as it were. The letter has been sent, albeit crossly, by the Prime Minister to Brussels. Are you now convinced and happy that the extension will be granted and that, therefore, the prospect of us leaving the EU without a deal at the end of this month is gone?
Look, we can never tell what the EU will do, and we can't control what the EU will do. We've always been clear about that, and there's always a slight risk that they wouldn't give an extension. My own gut instinct has been all the way along that if we got to the end and we were going to crash out otherwise, and we'd made a request for an extension, very probably the EU would say, have an extension.
Are we not still in the same situation as we always were, in the sense that if this bill goes through and we leave the EU and we're now into the next period of negotiations, at the end of next year, December 31st, 2020, we're again facing the prospect, if we haven't got a trade deal at that point, of leaving without a deal?
Well, the situation's a bit better than that, because if we get this deal across the line, and with support of people like me, I hope we can, I think we probably will, and we're exiting on or near to the 31st of October, and we move into the transitional implementation phase where nobody will spot the difference, and there's a proper negotiation of a free trade agreement. I am convinced, I do trust, that the Prime Minister is going to try and get a sensible free trade agreement. If that isn't achieved by 2020, as you say, there is a specific provision in Article 50 for that to be extended up to 2022. And I think long before 2022, it should be possible to get a proper...
That, of course, the Prime Minister.
I know, but he said on various occasions he's not going to do various things that actually...
So you don't trust him?
No. I trust his instinct and his motive, which is to get the deal, which I'm going to back him on, and then to get a free trade agreement, which I would also back, although I shan't be in the House of Parliament at that time. I'm just saying, unfortunately, his rhetoric is often that he says he'll never do something. Many politicians do this. And then, actually, when it comes to it, he's much more compromising and more sensible. So it's not a question of not trusting, it's just a question of observing that when he says he's never going to extend, we shouldn't take that at face value. He doesn't want to extend. I don't want to extend. I much prefer to see a free trade agreement in place by 2020. But if necessary, you've got till 2022.
If we ask the question, why are Brexiteers so angry with you at the moment, and so many of them believe that you're really against the whole project, you don't want us to leave the EU, you only have to look at the list of people who backed your amendment yesterday. Every single anti-Brexit MP backed your amendment. It was a kind of coalition of the anti-Brexit forces in Parliament, which leads many people to think behind the reasonable and urbane exterior, Oliver Letwin is against Brexit, and this is part of a plot to stop Brexit happening.
Yes, I know. It's very sad that people do get to thinking that if you are in alliance with people who have a different agenda, and I was in alliance with people who had different agendas. Yes, of course, most of the people voting for these things have been all the way along people who didn't want Brexit or passionate about a referendum or whatever it may be. That's not my view. My view is we need an orderly exit. And if you're going to achieve that, and if the government isn't willing to do it on its own, then you have to ally yourself with some strange people, so to speak, people who have differing views. But
dangerous
the fact
to
is,
smile at them too broadly in front of cameras.
I know, I shouldn't ever smile. But the fact is, I'm a human being, and if somebody is making a joke, I laugh. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The truth is that there's something really important at stake here, which is the question, is our country going to try to achieve some compromise solution that gets an orderly exit where, yes, OK, the people I was working with yesterday are going to be dissatisfied because it's not remaining and it's not a referendum, and the people who are on the extreme end of the Brexit spectrum are going to be dissatisfied because it's not a clean break, as they call it, and a disorderly exit. But the fact is 80% of the people in this country or something, I think, can live with this deal, want to compromise. Yeah. I've been seeking a compromise all the way through for 18 months. Okay. That's why I voted for Theresa's deal. Right. That's why I'll vote for this deal. It's not perfect, but it'll do.
You've been under huge amounts of personal pressure, not just from media and campaigners, but also from Number 10. How intense was it? And was there any moment yesterday when you think, I'm beginning to wobble, I might pull this?
No, I thought we were doing the right thing. This hasn't been very pleasant for me for 18 months or for many other people.
What kind of pressure did they put on you?
Oh, I'm not going to go into all the details. But the fact is, you go into politics, you go to your electorate, they do the honour of electing you, you owe them something. And what you owe them is to try to do the right thing and to continue doing it, even if a lot of people are cross with you. That's how politics is.
Yes. You went into Number 10 on Friday, into the lion's den at the crucial moment. What happened?
Well, the Prime Minister and I had various conversations, and I had some conversations with officials. I'm not going to...
Friendly conversations?
Yes, perfectly, actually. I mean, the sad truth is, so to speak, that between politicians, on the whole, relations are perfectly amicable, and Boris is a very charming man.
And he was quite emollient in his speech in the House of Commons yesterday. The first part of the speech, anyway, was trying to reach out to the 48%.
Yes, I thought he had a good tone, yeah.
But that didn't influence you on the day.
No, because I was trying to achieve a concrete result, which is to make sure we had the insurance policy in place so that if anything goes wrong, we don't crash out on the 31st of October. It's a very simple proposition, and I think a true one. If you think it's true, you think it's in the interest of the country, you have to do it.
So, Oliver, thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. Now, looking closely at the numbers, it may be we're not sure that Boris Johnson has suffered a humiliating defeat in battle, but he has not lost the war. And this week he may win it if his deal passes through the House of Commons. So how is Labour going to react? Ever since the summer, Sir Keir Starmer has been the party's leading strategist on all of this, and he's sitting with me now. Sir Keir, welcome. What are you going to do next week?
Well, the first thing we're going to do is make sure that we get the extension that is required under the Benn Act. We've had this silly approach by the Prime Minister on that. So that's the first thing.
Can I just stop you on that and ask you about this? Because we've had 3 letters sent, we've had various telephone calls made. Are you satisfied that he has answered the spirit of the law as well as the letter of the law? And is there any chance of you ending up in court tomorrow on all of this?
He's being childlike. The law is very clear. He should have signed one letter in accordance with the law. He's being childlike. And if, I don't think it'll happen, but if we crash out because of what he's done with the letters in 11 days' time without a deal, he bears personal responsibility for that. So that's the first fight.
You're not saying he's going to have to go to court about this, and you're not going to take him to court?
I'm sure there'll be court proceedings, but the first thing we're going to do in Parliament is deal with that issue. The second thing, then, is if he brings in a bill to implement his deal, we will fight amendments on that because his deal is a very, very bad deal, and it has within it a trapdoor to no deal at the end of next year. The third thing...
So, again, I'm going to stop you on those things. We need to go through the things one by one. Yeah. So the amendments you're going to put down, are those amendments on the substance of the deal that he has made, trying to change the deal?
It is.
And if so, which ones?
It is essential that we expose this deal for what it is, because it's a deal that fundamentally changes our economy and our approach. So we need to do that. There are technical...
exposing a deal is one thing. That's a political game, as it were. But are you going to try and change the deal, is my question.
We will put down amendments to make sure that the future destination is a close economic relationship with the EU. But there's more than that, Andrew, because there's also...
I keep stopping you on this because the detail is really, really important. So the amendments will say, in effect, that we stay inside the customs union or alongside the customs union, inside or alongside the single market? What kind of...
We've been arguing for a very long time now for a customs union with the EU and for single market alignment. There are other amendments that are really important because there's a trapdoor to no deal at the end of 2020 that we need to deal with and close, and we can do that in the legislation. And, of course, we need an amendment to say that whatever deal gets through, it should be subject to a referendum where that deal is put to the public and they're asked, do you want to leave on these terms or would you rather remain in the EU? So next week's going to be busy.
There'll be an amendment next week to any legislation calling for a second referendum or a so-called people's vote.
Andrew, it's inevitable. It's been down many times when we've got to this stage of the exercise. When that bill goes down, it is inevitable that that amendment will be put down because a growing number of people now think the only way truly to settle this is to ask people, do you want to leave on these terms or would you rather remain? And this is much more than a technical question about this deal, because the more you read this deal, the more the untruths and half-truths of Boris Johnson are exposed. This is to shatter the economic model that we operate and take us in a deregulated direction that is fundamental and will be for generations.
This is a very important moment. Will the Labour front bench actually be putting down an amendment for a referendum and then vote for it?
I think it's more likely that it'll come from the backbench because almost every victory we've had...
Will Labour back it then?
Yes. Almost every victory we've had on anything in the last 3 years has come from the backbenches. That's how we got the meaningful vote. That's how we got any progress in this.
Right. So Labour will be whipped to back a second referendum vote next week.
Andrew, we've already voted, I think, 3 times as a party for a second referendum with a 3-line whip behind it. And that is the clear policy. Whether it's this deal or any future deal, it's got to go back so the public can say, do you want to leave on these terms? If so, then we do. If not, we remain.
And if you're successful and that amendment is attached to the deal, do you then vote for the deal?
Well, we'll see what that looks like, but it makes sense to say that by whatever means we get that referendum.
You know what it looks like. You know what the deal is. If you attach the referendum, again, I ask you, and the deal's there, but with a referendum attached to it in law, do you then back that?
Well, the spirit of this is very, very clear. And we actually offered this to Theresa May, which said, we don't think your deal is very good, but if it's up against the safeguard of being able to remain, then we'll allow it to proceed in that way.
So now, the answer to my question is really yes, isn't it? That if you win on your referendum amendment, you will then vote for the deal. It will then go through and you get your referendum.
Well, Andrew, you heard me express the principle thing. We'll have to look at the particular amendments. We'll have to look at the vote at the end of it. But what we're trying to achieve is that this deal in particular, but any deal, is put up against Remain in a referendum. And we're focused on that. And we'll have to see tactically how we get there. But what we're trying to achieve, I think, is very, very clear.
And you would agree that to have a referendum requires quite complicated primary legislation?
Yes.
And that requires the government at some stage being behind it? Or are you going to try and put all the detail of that into your amendment so that you get the detail of the amendment inside the legislation next week?
Andrew, I don't know the answer to that because we're all working on it. There will be an amendment on a referendum. Whether there will be detailed amendments put next week for the whole of the referendum, I don't know. There's lots of discussions going on. But the principle is very, very clear. I accept the point you put to me, which is if there is to be a referendum, it's going to need detailed legislation.
So the detailed legislation won't be coming this week, which means you're reliant on the government, trusting the government to put that legislation in. Things like what is the question and when it happens.
Well, Parliament will be in charge of that because if Parliament decides that the choice should be between the deal that Boris Johnson says is so great, if so, let him have the confidence to put it to the public, or Remain. If Parliament says that's the choice, then that's what goes in the legislation.
Now, talking to various experts in all of this, they all say that it takes at least 22 weeks to run a proper, legally safe referendum campaign. That's between 5 and 6 months. That's a long time. Are you seriously suggesting that we should have, in effect, a government with no majority in the House of Commons, unable perhaps to get its budget through, unable perhaps to get the Queen's speech through for another 6 months while we have the referendum? Or are you expecting a general election before that referendum?
Well, I accept that's going to be very difficult. I accept that's probably the time frame. I think it could be shortened a bit, but probably not much. But this is such a fundamental question that we have to press this point about a referendum. Now, if a general election comes first, as you know, the Labour Party is saying we would seek to improve the deal and secure a better deal, as it were, but still put it back against Remain in a referendum. So, in a sense, whether it's a general election or not, the position we've adopted is whatever the outcome, whether it's Boris Johnson's bad deal or a better one, which could be secured, it's got to go to a referendum up against Remain.
So, in your guts, what do you think? Will we be sitting here this time next week, having seen Labour backing Boris Johnson's deal with a referendum amendment attached to it?
Look, Andrew, I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know, because things are moving so fast. What I do know is this, that the more scrutiny there is of Boris Johnson's deal, the more I think people are going to be persuaded that it's a very bad deal. And one of the reasons I think he's trying to bounce us through this is because if you look at the detail, it exposes his half-truths and untruths.
But people, I mean, with respect, people maybe have had enough of the principle and they want to know in practical terms what is going to happen. And it doesn't sound to me like you have a full worked-out argument for a second referendum amendment to go through next week. And actually, you don't know whether it's exactly what's going to happen and exactly, if it does happen, what you're going to do next.
Well, Andrew, the way these things work is that different amendments are put down. I suspect there'll be dozens of amendments put down this week. We will work through all of them. We will decide which ones we're supporting. I don't know which ones are going to be selected, and there are lots and lots of discussions to be had. That's how it's happened for the last 3 years. This is not unusual, it's not special about next week.
So discussions, you say. Absolutely critical of this, obviously, is the DUP.
Yes.
Are you talking to them about this? They indicated they might back a referendum.
I would openly invite the DUP to talk to us, because anybody who wants to improve on the situation that they do should be working together. So I say to any MP, any party, but to the DUP in particular, if you want to work with us on this to improve the situation we're in, our door is open to that discussion.
Now, the letter has been sent to Brussels, and obviously you're waiting for the response from Brussels. But assuming that you get an extension response from Brussels that ensures that we do not, quotes, crash out at the end of this month, presumably at that point you put down a vote of no confidence and we have an election.
Well, when we put that vote down will be a matter for Jeremy Corbyn. But what we've said is that once we know that no deal's off the table because there's an extension, that is obviously on the table. Exactly when it's put is a matter for Jeremy Corbyn.
But he says we will then be ready with a motion of no confidence. We know the Prime Minister wants an election. That is presumably when it all happens.
Well, as I say, it's definitely on the table at that point. We have been waiting to ensure, we haven't yet got there, that there is the extension, that no deal is off the table. Once we get to that point, we'll have a discussion and decide what we do.
So Jeremy Corbyn says, we've said our priority is to prevent a no-deal exit, which is what you've done.
Yeah.
And at that point, when that has been achieved, then we will be ready with a motion of no confidence. So that seems to me, as soon as a message comes back from the EU saying, OK, we grant you the extension, at that point, Labour has a kind of moral and political duty to put down a motion of no confidence and have an election.
Look, Andrew, I think an election is inevitable because of the numbers in Parliament, because we've got to break the impasse. The timing will be a matter for Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the opposition. The conditions are clear. He's set them out. I've set them out. But it's inevitable that sooner or later this breaks into a general election.
Do you think that the next leader of the Labour Party should be a woman?
I think it's a very strong case for the next leader to be a woman. What I think is most important is that we build on what we've got at the moment, and we build on that 2017 manifesto that was so popular in our movement across the trade union movement.
So you won't be putting yourself up for it?
Well, I'm not going to start
because you're clearly
answering.
not a woman.
I'm clearly not a woman, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
So it sounds to me like you're not putting yourself up for the next leadership of the Labour
Andrew,
Party.
I'm not even discussing that. I'm 100% behind Jeremy Corbyn.
You are now.
I am working with Jeremy Corbyn to try to win the next general election. I think it is critical, because my big concern is this. People look at the deal and look at the technicalities. What they're missing is the big picture, which is that this is going to shatter our economic model, move it to an American-style economy, deregulated. That'll be terrible for working people, terrible for the standards that we enjoy, and it will take... Once you've moved out... Just hear me. Once you've moved out of alignment with the EU, once you've moved the model we've been operating for decades, you are down a slippery slope. I know the government will disavow it, and we will look back on this moment and say, historically, our country changed for the worse. That, to me, is far more important than a hypothetical discussion about who may or may not be leader of the Labour Party in how many years' time.
So all those things that the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons yesterday about workers' rights being enhanced, environmental protections being better after we leave the EU, you simply don't believe him?
No, I don't. Of course he would say that. Just as he said to the DUP, no Conservative Prime Minister would ever put a border in the Irish Sea. He said that to them yesterday. He put that before them, which is why they won't back him. So why would anybody trust him, of all people?
And looking at all of this and what's happened since, you must really think to yourself, we should have accepted the Theresa May offer on workers' rights and environmental protections and all the rest of it when we were offered it. It was a big mistake to turn that down.
Of course not. In those 6 weeks of talks, we put to Theresa May over and over again that we should have a customs union, single market alignment, and she wouldn't accept it and she couldn't deliver it. And even what she offered us, when she then put that before Parliament, was enough for our own side to take her out by the end of the week.
A woman who has been a Labour Party member for half a century and a Labour MP for 22 years said this week she could not stay in the Labour Party because of its anti-Semitism. How did you feel when you heard about Louise Ellman?
I think it's a really low moment, And what I want to do is to redouble our efforts to make sure that Louise and others feel that the Labour Party is a party that they can return to. We've already done a lot of work on this. We need to do more. But the end destination for me is a Labour Party where those that have left because of this issue feel that they can return. That will be the judgment for me. That'll be the test of whether we've succeeded.
You're loyal to Jeremy Corbyn, and you've spoken in his defence just now. But Louise Ellman says that he is a danger not just to the Labour Party, but to the entire British Jewish community.
I don't accept that. I do accept that as a Labour Party, we have to root out anti-Semitism and we have to demonstrate to people like Louise that this is a party that she can return to.
I don't want to over-labour this, but here is somebody who has been a Jewish person and has been in the Labour Party for half a century. That is her view. How can you just say that she's wrong?
I'm not saying that she's wrong. You put to me a whole cluster of things she thought about Jeremy Corbyn, and I personally don't find that this personalising, it takes us very far. We have got an issue with anti-Semitism in the party. We've got a problem that there is anti-Semitism. We've got a bigger problem that some people don't acknowledge it. We're working on that. We've got to do that collectively. The test will be whether those that have concerns, as Lewis did, feel that they can return to the Labour Party. When they do, I will consider we've succeeded.
Sir Keir, thanks very much indeed for talking to us. Now look at what's coming up on BBC One at 10:30.
Coming up on Sunday Morning Live, England football players subjected to racist abuse. Should they have stayed on the pitch?
Also, we'll hear from the former Buddhist monk running a $100 million business.
And super sleuth Hercule Poirot himself, David Suchet, reveals why the Belgian detective is still part of his life.
Join us at 10:30.
Meanwhile, I'm joined now by Boris Johnson's Deputy Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab. Mr Raab, you'll have heard that you are now facing almost certainly a Labour-backed amendment for another referendum when you put your legislation down next week. What's your reaction?
It's extraordinary. The Labour Party stood on a manifesto, just as we did, to give effect to the referendum in 2016. They're now clearly planning to reverse that, and that's a breach of faith with the voters. I think many of your viewers at home will be astonished. We've actually secured a deal with the EU. A lot of people said the Prime Minister couldn't do that. He's got that deal. We seem to have the numbers in the House of Commons. Why hasn't Parliament pushed this through? That's what we're going to do next week.
But if they get their amendment, then your deal will get through next week.
I'm sorry, I don't buy the twists and turns in that logic. We've got a deal. Why would you have a second referendum if you're going to give effect to Brexit? Well, the advantage of the deal is it deals with the, I think, legitimate concerns some have about a no-deal Brexit. Oliver Letwin has said, he was one of the authors of the motions on Saturday. He said that he will now vote with the deal. I think a lot of people think, get this done. We've got a deal. People had written the Prime Minister off. He's confounded the doubters. We seem to have the numbers in the House of Commons. If you look at from the ERG to the...
We don't know that yet,
We don't know that. But from what people said, and I take people at their word, and I think a lot of people say, get this done, move on. And actually, Keir can't answer the question of which way they'd campaign, but it seems pretty clear Labour would look to campaign to reverse Brexit. He can't answer the question of when we'd have a general election. We asked for a general election. The only leadership in all of this to take Britain forward is coming from Boris Johnson.
Well, let's look at the deal that he's done, and you say is a very, very good deal. Going forward, after this is all signed and sealed, if it is signed and sealed, are we going to be more regulated and higher taxed as an economy, or less regulated and lower taxed as an economy?
Well, I think the general election that we should have to give the voters their say on the future direction will settle that. But let me just give you a concrete example. We've had a Queen's speech where we've set out an environmental bill to make sure we are not just in Europe complying with standards, but world leaders. We've got an employment bill based on the Taylor Review to make sure we've got the best workers' rights. We've, unemployment at its lowest level since 1974. Sure. I would say this. I think workers are far safer under a Conservative government, given our economic record and the protections we're putting in place, than they would be under this shower of a Labour Party.
But what you haven't answered is my basic question, because there is no point, is there, in taking workers' regulation and environmental protection out of the legally binding withdrawal agreement and putting into the non-legally binding political declaration if you want to improve them, because you're allowed to do that anyway. The only reason for transferring them is to make them less. Otherwise, why bother doing it?
No, the withdrawal agreement just deals with the so-called divorce proceedings from the EU. We've said that there will be a level playing field provisions in the free trade deal we do with the EU, the second phase. But we're basically saying is these issues of employment rights, environmental protections are so important, and the circumstances in the UK are obviously different. Each country is different. We actually should make sure that politicians, whether it's Oliver Letwin, Keir Starmer or me, are accountable to the voters watching the show. Why would you abdicate responsibility for those issues if they're so important?
Or why would you move them out of a legally binding part of an agreement into a non-legally binding part of an agreement? The answer might be what Boris Johnson has always said about those kind of things. Let's just listen to him.
The weight of employment regulation is now backbreaking. The Collective Redundancies Directive, the Atypical Work Directive, the Working Time Directive, 1,000 more such regulations. The Health and Safety at Work Framework Directive, which means all businesses of whatever size have to keep written records of their risk assessments, even if it turns out that the risk is nil. And the total cost of this legislation for EU-generated employment law for the UK alone, for British business, is estimated to be about 8.6 billion a year.
Now, he hates all this kind of stuff, you hate all that kind of stuff, and after we've left, you're going to get rid of it.
No.
No?
No, let me explain.
That great big burden, you're going to keep
I listened very
staggering
carefully to
under
your long clip. The fact of the matter is we've got a very strong small business culture. The nature of our economy is different from some of the other continental economies. I think it's right to have smart regulation that's tailored to the best interests of British workers and British businesses. And we're introducing in our Queen's speech an employment bill to make sure that we have the strongest standards. And it's based on the review by Matthew Taylor, who was, of course, a Labour Party advisor for many years. So I don't think anyone can say that. But look, if these issues are important, and I think we all agree they are, surely they should be the democratic responsibility, politicians like Keir and me, accountable to the voters at home.
So if you take something like the Working Time Directive, how are we going to make the Working Time Directive stronger after Brexit?
Because we'll be able to make sure that all of the business concerns and considerations and all of the particular concerns that workers in our sectors of our economy can have a set of regulation which is smarter and tailored towards them. But actually what we've also said...
Really? So we're going to have a more onerous on business Working Time Directive?
No. But we've said that we will stick to all of the regulations at the point at which we leave the EU. But in the future, as our economy evolves, as we see shifts in the patterns of the way workers and the work-life balance evolves, we should be responsible to the voters at home for quite how that balance is calibrated. That puts them in control. That's what this referendum, that's what Brexit was all about.
This is terribly difficult for mere mortals to understand, because if you listen to people on your side of the argument, they're very, very clear. Here's Priti Patel, for instance, during the referendum campaign, I beg your pardon. She said, if we could just halve the burdens of EU social and employment legislation, we could deliver a £4 billion boost to our economy and 60,000 new jobs. It was very clear, and it makes, in its own terms, a lot of sense. Too much regulation, leave the EU, get rid of some regulation and let the economy grow faster. I'm surprised that you seem to find this so difficult, given where you come from.
No, where do I come from?
From the deregulating part of the Conservative Party.
I want to do the right thing by our businesses, but also our workers, and that means I want to have smarter regulation tailored to their needs, and you can't have that if it's made in Brussels by a whole load of legislators and bureaucrats who are actually thinking about other workers, other businesses in other countries. And we should have the best regulation tailored to our unique circumstances in the UK. And we should actually learn.
As long as they're British bureaucrats rather than foreign bureaucrats.
No, as long as they're accountable to the people watching the show.
All right, let's turn to the clear mistake that your government made this week, which is failing to listen hard enough to the DUP. Now, you said they've got a brilliant deal from Northern Ireland. That is not how it feels in Northern Ireland. There are a lot of really serious people involved in industry and agriculture who look at this deal and say it's worse than Theresa May's deal.
Well, I don't accept that. We've made sure that Northern Ireland will stay within the UK customs territory. That means that we've guaranteed the smooth flow east-west between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We've at the same time made sure there's no any infrastructure at the border with the Republic. And we've secured, this is the win for Northern Ireland business, on top of all of that, seamless access to the European single market. Now, I know that there are concerns from the DUP. I've listened, I talked to Nigel Dodds yesterday in the House of Commons. We respect them, we'll keep talking. But we've also secured a consent mechanism, which means in relation to those limited agri-food and industrialised goods regulations that Northern Ireland would stay aligned to as the price, if you like, for that seamless access to the EU and to respect the Good Friday Agreement, they have a consent mechanism, which means they decide on a majority in the Northern Ireland Assembly, not just once, but every 4 years.
Every 4 years.
That's a good deal. That's the democratic lock.
Well, you say it's a good deal.
Just one final thing. That democratic lock was not there in Theresa's deal.
OK, you say it's a very good deal. Here's the chief economist of the Ulster Bank, Richard Ramsey. He says it's significantly worse for the Northern Irish economy than May's deal. More bureaucracy, red tape and complexity, adding to the costs of doing business. Manufacturing Northern Ireland, same sort of thing. There's a potential for significant new frictions for some trade to Northern Ireland from Great Britain and a complex and costly regime to manage tariffs for goods travelling through Northern Ireland to the EU. The Ulster Farmers Union and the food and drink industry say exactly the same thing. They all think this means more bureaucracy, more friction, and it's bad for them.
Well, again, I think if we go through each of the measures that I described, the opportunity to safeguard east-west trade, then make sure that there's no any infrastructure at the border with the Republic and seamless access to the single market, plus the opportunity for Northern Ireland to be clearly, and this is another thing that wouldn't have happened in Theresa's deal, be part of any new free trading arrangements that we put in place around the world with the growth markets of the future. I think over both the short term in terms of the risk, but also the long term over the opportunities, this is a really strong deal.
This can sound a bit abstract to folk watching back home, so let's take something very, very simple and concrete and easy to understand. An awful lot of Northern Ireland's milk production goes to the south for processing, where it's turned into milk powder or whatever. And it's then going into markets, not just in the EU, but into lots of countries in the Far East and the Middle East, where the EU have deals to do as well. Will those farmers' milk be able to take advantage of those deals going forward?
So which deals do you want them to take advantage of?
The deals between the EU and Far Eastern countries, for instance. So Northern Irish milk is going into cheese or milk powder, whatever, which goes into the EU and then goes to the Far East. Will that carry on happening?
So there's two aspects. One, in relation to the free trade deals the EU has, we're making sure we've got as many of them in place from day one. And if we sign the deal that we've got with the EU, when we put it through Parliament, we'll have the implementation period to make sure...
So you don't really know at this point?
Well, hold on. We'll make sure we keep all of those in place. We've made huge progress on that. And then the second aspect is all of the fresh opportunities, because we're going to have a free trade policy that is aligned to the best interest of the whole of the United Kingdom, not all of the other European producers. And we will have a more energetic and, I believe, liberal approach to free trade. And that is going to be good news for all quarters of the Union.
And is this milk that we're talking about, is this British milk that's going into the chain, into the EU chain?
Well, you're talking about two different things now.
No, I'm not. I'm talking about the same milk coming from the same cows in Ulster. I'm asking you, what is the status of that milk going into the EU?
Well, if it's going into the EU, then it ought to be able to take place without any extra frictions or any extra tariffs. Okay, if it's going into other parts of the world, then you have to look at the arrangements either the EU has that we succeed to, or the new arrangements that the UK puts in place. But the bottom line is this. We will secure the existing trade arrangements, but we'll have much more energy and scope for doing new trading arrangements, which will be even better for growth for the future, for small businesses and also for consumers in Northern Ireland and in the rest of the United Kingdom.
So this is such a fantastic deal for Northern Ireland. Why can't the rest of us have it?
Well, it's not on offer.
Exactly.
No, it's not on offer from the EU. Let's be very clear about this. This is something that's been put back to me a couple of times. The EU weren't offering. You may remember when Chequers proposals were putting forward. They said you're dividing up the single market. You can't cherry pick from the single market. This is only being offered in relation to Northern Ireland because of the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland. But I think it's really important that the EU has made that flexibility and compromise. And that's why we've, I think, unlocked this deal, one of the aspects, and we can move forward. Let's get this deal done. Let's get Britain, one whole United Kingdom, moving forward.
Now, Prime Minister said do or die will be out by October the 31st, or on October the 31st. Yes. Will we?
Yes, I'm confident we will be. Look, we can't...
But we've asked for an extension. If the extension is granted, and as Peter Foster said, it almost certainly will be granted, whether it's long or short.
So Peter Foster's long been a very pro-EU commentator, and that's fine.
He's a very good journalist. He wouldn't agree with that. He's a very good journalist,
he's
very, very plugged in.
And look, my point would be this. The Prime Minister has done exactly what he said he was going to do. He has complied with the law, so Parliament's request has been conveyed to the EU. He's also, as you know, you've been commenting about it today, made very clear in a separate letter that his view hasn't changed. Parliament can't muzzle the Prime Minister. He doesn't want an extension. But above all, he's proved the doubters wrong this week by getting a deal that can pass through the House of Commons and getting the EU to move. People said, I mean, it wasn't so long ago that people like Peter Foster and others, and many of the people commentating on your show, said there's no way they would open with the withdrawal agreement, let alone agree fresh arrangements. He's achieved all of that.
Let's just go back to the basics. He always said he wouldn't ask for an extension. He has asked for an extension, and Donald Tusk has already tweeted that he's received the application for an extension. Unless the EU changes its mind dramatically and says you can't have an extension, we will have an extension.
So that doesn't even follow in terms of what you just said. Donald Tusk has acknowledged that he's received the request.
Yes.
There's many people in the EU that are deeply uncomfortable about more delay, and the Prime Minister's also made clear, the government's view, that we shouldn't have more delay, and that what we now need to do, and what I think people at home will expect...
You're confident the EU will not give us a delay?
Look, I don't speak for the EU, but I do know from the commentary both inside Brussels and from EU member states that they're fed up with this now, and we're fed up with it. And I think what a lot of people, as I said at the start, at home will be thinking, but you've got a deal, you've got a new deal. You also seem to have the numbers. Get on, get it through the House of Commons, and let's move on. I think that's what overwhelmingly, whether people voted Leave or Remain, they now want to see happen. And I think that's what Parliament should do next week.
Well, we've had a lot of discussion in the British political system, but we are basically now in the hands of Brussels to decide whether they give us an extension or they don't give us an extension. If they do, there's nothing the British government can now do about it. Then we don't leave on the 31st.
I don't think that's correct. But
OK, well, talk us through why it's not correct.
Well, so first of all, the Prime Minister's been clear. He's not going to negotiate on this. He doesn't think it should happen.
Doesn't need to. He's asked for it.
Well, you know, there'll be all sorts of people on the other side that think that he hasn't done the right thing because he didn't sign it or whatever. What he's done is what he always said he would do, comply with the law. The message from Parliament has been conveyed. He's also made the government's position very clear. But above all, the game changer this week, which we've hardly talked about at all, is that he's defied the doubters, got a deal. And we also now, notwithstanding the shenanigans in Parliament, appear to have now the numbers to get this through. The only question is, why aren't we getting on with it?
If you've got the numbers to get it through, you need the DUP back on side, don't you? What are you going to do to get the DUP back on side? Because if you don't, it's going to be very, very tight and you might lose it all again.
Well, there's always possible. We believe we've got the numbers, and we'll keep talking to the DUP and see if there's further reassurances that can be provided. But we've got a good deal for every quarter of the United Kingdom, and I think ultimately now, whether you voted Leave or Remain, and the polling all backs this up, people just think, get on with this, get this done, let's move on. And only the government, and only Boris Johnson, if you listen to what Keir was saying, or anyone else that's commentating on this, only the Conservatives have got this plan under Boris to get us moving forward.
Let's assume that it all goes well for you next week, that you see off the motion on the referendum and you get your legislation through the Commons next week and you're on course, and we leave before October the 31st or immediately after October the 31st, but we leave soon with the deal that's been negotiated. Let's assume all of that. We then go through a year, almost exactly, of negotiating about our future trade arrangements, which will be difficult. Let's be clear. It won't be very easy. If at the end of that year we haven't got an agreement, we leave without a deal. It just delays the thing for a year.
Well, one of the things I looked at when I was...
Is that true?
One of the things I looked at when I was Brexit Secretary is whether in the withdrawal agreement we could bind the EU to actually do the free trade agreement. And what we've got is a best endeavours clause, which says that we'll go into this with the templates set out in the political declaration, but we can't force the EU to sign it at the end. What I do think that will happen, if we get the first phase through in the way that you described, whole cloud will lift, the economy will get a boost, I think the rancour at home will come out of the Brexit debate, and I think we'll be able to move forward in good faith with our EU partners on the positives.
Okay.
And the reason I say this is...
If we don't get that deal in the year, do we extend or not? Would we say no extension, that's it?
I think the Prime Minister's been clear. We don't want an extension. We want to get it done. People said that he couldn't get a deal on the withdrawal agreement, and he's done it in very quick time. I think we should be ambitious, confident, and go into this with the right spirit. And I don't just say that in terms of reaching out and bringing people together back home, but also actually saying, look, our EU partners are friends. Okay. We've done this deal. Let's get a positive future relationship, and let's get Britain moving forward.
It's been a very interesting conversation. Dominic Raab, thanks very much for talking to us. Thanks for watching to all of you, and thanks to all of my guests today. I will be back at the same time next week. Don't forget the clocks go back an hour next Sunday. Who knows where we'll be politically by then? But for now, goodbye.